"You should have never survived this family," my mother whispered into my ear at my college graduation party just seconds before handing me a glass of champagne and smiling for the camera like she was the proudest mother in America. Everyone around us laughed and clinked glasses beneath the soft golden lights hanging across my parents' backyard in suburban Connecticut, but the moment those words left her mouth, something inside me turned cold. I remember staring at her lipstick stain on the rim of the glass while my father wrapped his arm around one of his business partners and announced to the crowd that his daughter had graduated summa cum laude from Yale with honors in economics. To everyone else, it looked like the perfect family celebration. Expensive catering. White roses on every table. A jazz trio playing near the pool. My mother in a cream-colored dress greeting guests with polished smiles. My father shaking hands like he was campaigning for office. And me standing there in my navy graduation dress and silver heels, pretending not to notice how neither of them had looked me directly in the eyes all evening. "Smile, Evelyn," my father muttered through clenched teeth as another camera flashed in our faces. "For once in your life, try not to embarrass us." I smiled because I'd been practicing that smile since I was 12 years old. The polite one. The harmless one. The smile that kept the peace while my younger brother Mason got praised for breathing and I got criticized for existing too loudly. Mason was leaning against the patio bar scrolling through his phone while guests congratulated him almost as much as they congratulated me. My mother always had a way of redirecting attention toward him. "Mason has been such a support to his sister," she kept saying, even though he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me all month. I lifted the champagne glass to my lips because refusing it would have created a scene, and scenes were unacceptable in the Carter family unless they were carefully staged for social media. The drink tasted strange. Slightly bitter beneath the bubbles. I lowered the glass slowly. My mother noticed. Her eyes locked onto mine for half a second too long. Then she smiled again and turned toward a group of guests near the dessert table. "Evelyn has always been dramatic," she laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Even as a child. A few people chuckled politely. I felt heat rising behind my eyes, but I swallowed it down the way I always did. That was the rule in our house. Feel nothing. Need nothing. Ruin nothing. The music blurred slightly around me as another wave of dizziness rolled through my chest. At first I thought maybe I hadn't eaten enough because I'd spent the entire afternoon helping set up tables while my mother criticized every tiny detail. But then my fingers started trembling around the stem of the glass. The lights above the patio looked too bright. Too sharp. I reached for the edge of the table beside me. "You okay?" Claire whispered suddenly beside me. My best friend had arrived late after driving 3 hours from Boston, and the concern in her voice was immediate. I opened my mouth to answer her, but the ground tilted underneath me so suddenly that I nearly lost my balance. Across the yard, I saw my father watching me carefully. Not worried. Not confused. Watching. My mother leaned toward him and said something I couldn't hear. Then they both smiled while guests continued laughing around them beneath the string lights and summer music. The last thing I remember before everything went black was hearing my father calmly tell someone, "Evelyn's always had a flair for attention." The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee drifting through the hospital room. The second thing I noticed was that my parents were nowhere to be seen. Soft rain tapped against the window beside my bed while a heart monitor beeped steadily near my shoulder. For a few seconds, I could not remember how I got there. Then flashes of the party came back in pieces. String lights glowing above the backyard. My mother smiling too perfectly. The bitter taste in the champagne. My father watching me from across the patio with that cold, unreadable expression he always wore whenever he thought I was becoming inconvenient. I tried to sit up too quickly and pain spread through my head like pressure behind my eyes. "Easy," Claire said softly from the chair beside my bed. I turned toward her and realized she was still wearing the same black dress from the party, except now her mascara was smudged and her hair was pulled into a loose knot like she had not slept all night. "How long have I been here?" My voice sounded dry and weak. Claire immediately handed me a cup of water with a straw. "About 9 hours," she said quietly. "You scared me, Evelyn." I stared at the ceiling for a moment while the memory settled heavier inside my chest. "What happened?" Claire hesitated. That alone made my stomach tighten. Claire never hesitated unless she was trying to protect someone from the truth. "Your parents told everyone you had a panic attack," she finally said. "They said graduation stress got to you." I let out a weak laugh that did not sound like laughter at all. "Of course they did." Claire looked away for a second before leaning closer. "Evelyn, there is something else." I watched her fingers tighten around the paper coffee cup in her lap. "The doctor ran blood work because you lost consciousness so suddenly." My throat felt tight. "And?" Claire lowered her voice even though we were alone. "They found traces of a sedative in your system." The room went completely still around me. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. I stared at her without blinking. "A sedative?" She nodded slowly. "The doctor said it could have interacted badly with alcohol." "They asked if you take any medication." "I do not." My voice came out almost as a whisper. Claire swallowed hard before speaking again. "The nurse told me something strange too. She said when the ambulance arrived at your house, your parents seemed more annoyed than worried." I closed my eyes for a moment because hearing it out loud somehow hurt more than I expected. Deep down, I knew exactly what Claire meant. My parents had spent my entire life treating my emotions like flaws that embarrassed them publicly. Crying at 12 because my father forgot my birthday dinner. Being called dramatic. Getting accepted into Yale and hearing my mother complain that tuition would ruin their travel plans. Winning scholarships and still being told I owed them for everything. Nothing I ever achieved was enough to make them proud. It only made them resentful in quieter ways. "Did they come here at all?" I finally asked. Claire shook her head slowly. "Your father called once. He asked if the hospital planned to discharge you before noon because people were still posting party photos online." I turned my head toward the rain-streaked window beside the bed and suddenly felt colder than I had moments before. Somewhere out there, my graduation party still existed on social media like a glossy lie. Smiling family photos. Champagne glasses raised in celebration. My mother probably replying to comments with little heart emojis while strangers called us beautiful and blessed. Nobody could see what lived underneath that family portrait. Nobody could hear the way my mother whispered to me when nobody else was listening. Claire reached for my hand carefully. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "I really think something is wrong here." I stared at the pale hospital blanket covering my legs while the memory of that champagne glass replayed itself over and over inside my head. The bitterness. My mother watching me drink it. My father smiling when I started losing balance. And for the first time in my life, a thought entered my mind that terrified me more than collapsing at that party ever could. Maybe my parents had stopped seeing me as their daughter a long time ago. I was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon with instructions to rest, stay hydrated, and avoid stress for a few days, which would have been funny if my entire life had not been built around surviving stress inside my parents' house. Claire drove me back to my apartment just outside New Haven while soft grey clouds hung low across the highway. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The silence between us felt heavy but careful, like we were both afraid that saying certain thoughts out loud would make them too real to ignore. My phone had been buzzing non-stop since morning. Messages from old classmates. Professors congratulating me again. Party guests asking if I was feeling better after my so-called panic attack. I ignored all of them. But there was one message I could not stop staring at. My mother had texted me at exactly 8:13 that morning. "You embarrassed us last night. Call your father when you are ready to apologize. No concern. No question about whether I was okay. Just embarrassment." I kept rereading the message while Claire drove because even after everything, part of me still wanted to believe there had to be another explanation. Maybe the sedative was accidental. Maybe someone else tampered with the drink. Maybe my parents were simply cold people who cared more about appearances than emotions. But then another memory surfaced. One I had buried years ago because that is what children do when the truth hurts too much. I was 15 years old at a country club dinner for one of my father's clients. I accidentally spilled sparkling water across the tablecloth while reaching for bread. My mother smiled politely at the guests the entire time, but the second we got into the car afterward, she hissed, "Do you enjoy humiliating us in public?" I remember staring at the dark highway through the passenger window while she continued talking about how difficult I had always been compared to Mason. My father did not defend me. He never did. He simply adjusted the radio volume higher while she spoke. That became the pattern of my childhood. My mother delivered the cruelty. My father silently approved it. By the time I reached college, I had become an expert at making myself smaller around them. Smaller emotions. Smaller opinions. Smaller needs. Even my successes somehow irritated them. When Yale mailed my acceptance letter, my mother stared at it for nearly a full minute before saying, "Do not expect us to brag about this if you end up becoming one of those arrogant career women." I should have recognized then that my achievements made them uncomfortable because achievements gave me independence. Independence meant control slipping away. Claire pulled into my apartment parking lot just as rain began falling again. "You should stay with me for a few days," she said quietly after turning off the engine. "I do not think you should be alone. Right now." I looked toward the apartment building entrance while exhaustion settled deeper into my bones. "I need to think," I whispered. Claire hesitated before reaching into her purse and handing me my graduation clutch. "The hospital gave this to me." I opened the small satin bag slowly. Lipstick. Wallet. Phone charger. Then my fingers brushed against something folded near the bottom. A cocktail napkin from the party. My stomach tightened instantly because there was handwriting across the front in dark blue ink. 3 words. "Finally out soon." I stared at the message while cold rain streaked down the windshield beside us. "What is it?" Claire asked softly. I could barely breathe for a second because I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father used the exact same sharp slanted letters on every birthday card he had ever signed for me. Outside the car, thunder rolled quietly across the Connecticut sky while a sick feeling spread through my chest. Maybe my parents had not simply disliked me. Maybe they had been waiting for me to disappear. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. Rain continued drifting across New Haven in slow gray waves while I sat on the couch inside my apartment replaying every moment from that graduation party over and over inside my head. The champagne. My mother watching me drink it. My father pretending not to notice when I lost balance. The message on the cocktail napkin. Finally out soon. Every time I tried convincing myself I was overreacting, another memory surfaced to prove I probably was not. Claire stayed with me the first night despite my insisting I was fine. Around midnight, she fell asleep under a blanket on the opposite end of the couch while I stared at old family photos on my phone. At first glance, we looked perfect. Ski vacations in Vermont. Summer trips to Cape Cod. Christmas cards with coordinated sweaters and polished smiles. But once I started looking closer, I noticed something unsettling. In almost every photo, Mason stood between my parents while I remained slightly off to the side. Sometimes my mother rested her hand on his shoulder while barely touching mine. Sometimes my father looked directly at Mason. With pride while looking at me like he was already exhausted by my existence. I remembered one Thanksgiving during my freshman year at Yale when my father toasted Mason for getting waitlisted at a mediocre business school while barely acknowledging that I had made the dean's list. "Your brother has leadership instincts," he told me afterward while carving pumpkin pie in the kitchen. "You are smart, Evelyn, but smart women can become difficult if they are not careful." At the time, I laughed weakly because daughters learn early how to survive certain fathers. You nod. You smile. You shrink yourself until their disappointment stops filling the room. Around noon the next day, my phone rang unexpectedly. Mason. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Hey, he said casually, like nothing strange had happened. I could hear television noise in the background. Mom said you were milking the hospital thing pretty hard. I closed my eyes slowly. I collapsed. Mason. Yeah, because you freak out over everything. His voice carried that familiar bored cruelty he had inherited from our mother. Dad is furious you made a scene at the party. Some clients were there. Clients. Even now, that was what mattered. Not whether I was okay. Not why there had been sedatives in my bloodstream. Just appearances. Did Mom or Dad tell you what the doctors found? I asked quietly. There was a brief silence. Too brief to be accidental. No idea what you are talking about, he muttered quickly. But something in his tone shifted. Uneasy. Defensive. Mason, I said carefully, did you notice anything strange that night? He laughed once under his breath. You always do this. Do what? Act like everyone is out to get you. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter beside me while cold anger slowly replaced the confusion I had been carrying for days. Someone put something in my drink. Silence again. Longer this time. Then I heard him exhale sharply. You should just let this go, Evelyn. My stomach tightened instantly. What does that mean? Another pause. Dad says you have always had a talent for ruining things when attention is not on you. I almost laughed because, even now, even after waking up in a hospital bed, my father was still rewriting reality fast enough to protect himself. Mason lowered his voice slightly before speaking again. Just take the apology money when they offer it. The room around me seemed to stop moving. Apology money. He immediately sounded nervous. Forget I said that. Mason. I have to go. The line disconnected before I could say another word. I stood frozen in my apartment kitchen while rain tapped softly against the windows. Apology money. Not concern. Not denial. Money. Like whatever happened at that party already had a price attached to it. Across the room, Claire slowly lowered the coffee mug she had been holding. I heard everything, she whispered. I looked down at my trembling hands and realized something terrifying. My brother was not shocked by what happened to me. He was worried I would not stay quiet about it. That night, I stopped thinking like a daughter and started thinking like someone trying to survive people who had already decided she was disposable. The realization settled slowly inside me while Claire washed dishes in my tiny apartment kitchen and old rainwater streaked down the windows overlooking the parking lot below. I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, staring at the Carter family insurance account my father had once added me to for financial education purposes. Normally, I ignored most of the documents because my father treated money like power and loved reminding everyone that none of us understood it the way he did. But now Mason's words kept replaying in my head. Take the apology money when they offer it. My fingers trembled slightly as I entered the old password I still remembered from high school. To my surprise, it worked. Several folders appeared immediately. Tax records. Property investments. Business liability policies. Then one folder caught my attention. Carter Family Trust beneficiaries. My stomach tightened as I clicked it open. Most of the documents were old estate planning files, but one entry had been updated less than 3 weeks earlier. I opened it slowly. My vision blurred for a second the moment I saw my own name attached to a newly activated life insurance policy worth $2 million. Beneath it were the listed beneficiaries. Sandra Carter. Richard Carter. 50% each. I stared at the screen while coldness spread through my chest so fast it almost hurt. The activation date sat there clearly at the bottom of the page. 3 days before my graduation party. Claire, I whispered. My voice sounded distant even to me. She walked over drying her hands with a kitchen towel before stopping beside the table. What happened? I turned the laptop toward her without speaking. Her expression changed almost instantly as she read the document. Oh my God. I could barely breathe. They insured me. Claire looked back at me slowly. Evelyn, I shook my head before she could say whatever sympathy was already forming in her eyes. No. No, this is not normal. I pointed at the screen with trembling fingers. Nobody secretly opens a $2 million policy on their daughter 3 days before she ends up in the hospital. The apartment suddenly felt too small around me. Too quiet. Every memory from childhood started rearranging itself into something uglier. My father constantly calling me expensive. My mother complaining about tuition costs loud enough for relatives to hear during holidays. The way they both reacted whenever I talked about moving away after graduation. Not sadness. Panic. As if losing control over me terrified them more than losing me entirely. Claire sat across from me slowly. Do you think they meant for you to die? The question hung in the room like smoke. I stared at the insurance document while my pulse thudded unevenly inside my throat. I do not know, I admitted quietly. But I think they wanted something bad enough that they were willing to risk it. Neither of us spoke for a long moment after that. Finally Claire looked up carefully. You need to go to the police. I almost laughed, but there was no humor left inside me anymore. And tell them what? That my wealthy parents dislike me and I fainted at a party. Claire opened her mouth to argue, but my phone suddenly lit up against the table before she could speak. Unknown number. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Hello? Silence. Soft breathing. Then my mother's voice came through calm and controlled like always. Your father and I think it would be best if you stopped asking questions. My entire body went still. Excuse me. Families survive by protecting each other, Evelyn. Her tone sounded almost gentle now. That frightened me more than if she had screamed. You have always had a tendency to make situations bigger than they are. I glanced at the insurance document still glowing on the laptop screen. You opened a life insurance policy on me. Silence. Then she sighed softly like I was exhausting her. You were always going to be useful eventually. The line disconnected before I could answer. For several seconds, neither Claire nor I moved at all. Outside my apartment window, another wave of rain drifted across the dark Connecticut streets while my mother's final sentence echoed through my head again and again. You were always going to be useful eventually. After my mother hung up, I sat perfectly still at the kitchen table while the insurance document glowed against the laptop screen between Claire and me like evidence from someone else's nightmare. The rain outside had finally stopped, but the silence left behind felt worse somehow. Too clean. Too empty. Claire kept looking at me carefully, like she was waiting for me to break apart, but the strange thing was I did not feel emotional anymore. I felt awake. Truly awake for the first time in my life. Growing up inside the Carter family had trained me to question my own instincts constantly. Every cruel comment became a joke I was too sensitive to understand. Every manipulation became concern. Every humiliation became my fault for reacting emotionally. But now the pieces no longer looked random. They fit together too neatly. The insurance policy. The sedative. My father's handwriting on the cocktail napkin. My mother warning me to stop asking questions instead of denying anything outright. None of this felt accidental anymore. Claire finally spoke softly. What are you going to do? I stared down at my hands for a moment before answering. Nothing. She blinked in surprise. Nothing? Not yet. My voice sounded calm now. Calm in a way that even frightened me slightly. If my parents think I suspect them, they will close ranks immediately. Claire leaned back slowly while I continued thinking out loud. My father built his entire career on controlling narratives. If I confront him directly, he will make me look unstable before I even finish speaking. I already knew how easily he could do it. Richard Carter was one of those men who donated to hospitals while emotionally destroying people in private. Country clubs loved him. Business magazines quoted him. Local charities praised his generosity every Christmas. Nobody would believe his daughter over him unless I had something undeniable. I closed the laptop gently and stood up. I need proof. Claire looked uneasy. Evelyn, this is dangerous. I walked toward the apartment window slowly, staring out at the wet parking lot below where streetlights reflected against the pavement in blurred yellow lines. No, I whispered quietly. What is dangerous is pretending I still have parents who love me. The words hurt more than I expected. Because despite everything, part of me still wanted them to call and explain it all away. I wanted my mother to say she had been angry and careless. I wanted my father to finally sound concerned. But deep down, I already knew neither of those things would happen. The next morning, I did something I had spent my entire life avoiding. I called my father first. He answered immediately. Evelyn, he said smoothly, like we were discussing brunch plans instead of my collapse at his party. Feeling better. I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of untouched coffee while keeping my voice light and careful. Much better. I think maybe the stress finally caught up to me. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. Measuring. Calculating. That is what your mother and I suspected, he replied calmly. You have always pushed yourself too hard. I almost laughed hearing him rewrite reality so effortlessly. I probably overreacted, I said quietly. I do not want this to become a family issue. Another pause. Then his tone softened noticeably for the first time in days. That is very mature of you. Mature. The word they always used whenever I stayed silent about something painful. I leaned against the counter while forcing my voice to remain steady. I actually wanted to apologize for embarrassing everyone at the party. Claire looked up sharply from across the room when she heard that. My father exhaled slowly into the phone, and I could practically hear his relief. Well, he said smoothly, we all make mistakes. Mistakes. Like waking up in a hospital with sedatives in your bloodstream was some unfortunate social misunderstanding. Maybe we could have dinner soon, I offered. Just family. My father hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Your mother would like that very much. After we hung up, Claire stared at me across the apartment in disbelief. You are going to have dinner with them? I set my phone down carefully on the counter. No, I answered softly. I am going to let them think they won. The dinner was scheduled for Friday night at my parents' house, exactly 1 week after my graduation party. My mother texted me the address like I had not spent 22 years growing up there. Family only, she added at the end of the message, followed by a smiling emoji that somehow felt more unsettling than anything else she had said to me recently. By the time Friday arrived, the sky over Connecticut had turned clear again after nearly a week of rain. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and summer heat as Claire parked 2 blocks away from my parents' neighborhood. I checked my reflection in the passenger mirror before stepping out of the car. Light makeup. Neutral expression. Pale blue sweater. I looked exactly like the version of Evelyn Carter my parents preferred. Quiet. Controlled. Easy to dismiss. Claire handed me the small recording device we had bought that morning from an electronics store downtown. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. I slipped the recorder into my purse beside my phone and nodded once. If they think I forgave them, they will stop being careful. Claire reached for my hand before I opened the car door. Call me immediately if something feels wrong. I managed a small smile. Something already feels wrong. My parents' house looked beautiful as always. White colonial exterior. Perfect hedges. Warm porch lights glowing against the early evening sky. The kind of home people pointed at while saying things like good families live there. My mother opened the front door before I even knocked. Evelyn, she said softly, pulling me into a brief hug that smelled like expensive perfume and cold calculation. You look much better." Behind her, jazz music played quietly through the dining room speakers while candles flickered across the long oak table. My father stood near the kitchen pouring wine like we were hosting a holiday dinner instead of pretending an attempted poisoning never happened. Mason sat at the far end of the table scrolling through his phone. Nobody mentioned the hospital. Nobody mentioned the insurance policy. The entire evening moved with the polished rhythm of people performing normalcy for an invisible audience. During dinner, my mother asked carefully rehearsed questions about my future plans. My father discussed business headlines and property taxes between bites of steak. Mason barely looked at me. I answered politely while keeping my voice soft and agreeable. Every few minutes, I caught my father studying me with subtle curiosity, like he was trying to decide whether I truly believed the panic attack story. Halfway through dessert, my mother finally set down her fork and sighed gently. "We have all been under stress lately," she said in the tone people use before pretending accountability. "Families say unfortunate things sometimes." I looked up slowly. "Like calling your daughter a leech." Silence settled over the table instantly. My father reached for his wineglass without looking at me. My mother's expression barely changed at all. "You know how emotional that evening became," she replied smoothly. "Your father and I were overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Such a clean little word for years of cruelty hidden beneath polished smiles. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The doctors found sedatives in my bloodstream. Mason froze beside the table. My father finally looked at me directly. "Calm. Controlled. Dangerous." "And?" he asked. Quietly. I stared at him carefully. I was wondering if either of you had an explanation for that. My mother gave a small laugh under her breath. "Honestly, Evelyn, this obsession is becoming exhausting." My fingers tightened beneath the table near my purse where the recorder continued capturing every word. "So you deny knowing anything about it?" I asked softly. My father slowly folded his napkin beside his plate before speaking. "You have always confused discomfort with abuse." The room felt colder suddenly. "What does that mean?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same detached expression he used during business negotiations. "It means your generation turns every hardship into victimhood." My mother nodded gently beside him. "You were difficult to raise, Evelyn." There it was. The sentence buried underneath my entire childhood. Difficult. Expensive. Emotional. Unwanted. I stared at the candlelight reflecting across the polished dining table while something inside me finally settled into certainty. They were never going to admit what they had done because they truly believed I deserved it. For several seconds after my father finished speaking, nobody at the table moved at all. The candles flickered softly between us while jazz music drifted through the dining room speakers with eerie calmness. My mother reached for her wineglass gracefully, completely unbothered by the tension hanging in the room. Mason kept staring down at his untouched dessert like a child trying not to get dragged into an argument he already understood too well. I realized then that this conversation was not unusual for them. They had spent years rewriting reality together until cruelty sounded reasonable and pain sounded inconvenient. My father broke the silence first. "You have always been prone to dramatic thinking," he said evenly. "Your mother and I spent your entire childhood trying to help you manage that." I almost smiled hearing him say it because the performance was so polished. Calm voice. Controlled posture. Concern disguised as superiority. If someone else had walked into the room at that moment, they probably would have believed him immediately. "Do you know what I remember most about your childhood?" my mother asked suddenly. She folded her napkin carefully beside her plate before looking at me with cold softness. How exhausting it was. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they surprised me, but because she said them so casually. Like discussing bad weather. I stared at her quietly while old memories surfaced one after another. Sitting alone after piano recitals while she praised other children. Hearing her complain about my tuition during Christmas dinner. watching her beam with pride every time Mason walked into a room while I learned to apologize simply for existing too visibly. "I was a child," I said quietly. My father shrugged once. "Some children are easier to love than others." Mason finally looked up sharply at that, but he still said nothing. That hurt almost as much as everything else. Because silence was the Carter family language. Silence protected reputations. Silence protected money. Silence protected people like my parents. I slowly reached for my water glass while keeping my expression neutral. "So that is it?" I asked softly. "You spent years resenting me because I was inconvenient." My mother sighed gently like a tired therapist dealing with a difficult patient. "Evelyn, you always demanded emotional energy nobody had time for." Emotional energy. I wondered if she even heard herself anymore. My father leaned forward slightly then, lowering his voice. "You are intelligent enough to understand reality, so let me be clear." The room seemed colder suddenly. "You embarrassed this family repeatedly growing up." Emotional outbursts. Defiance. Constant need for attention. Your mother and I invested heavily in fixing those tendencies. I felt something inside me settle into complete stillness. Fixing? My father held my gaze calmly. "Helping you become manageable." Across the table, Mason quietly muttered, "Dad," but my father ignored him completely. I realized then that this was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from him. Not love. Not regret. Ownership. That was how my parents saw family. Useful people deserved warmth. Difficult people deserved correction. Suddenly my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse beside the recording device. A text from Claire. The bartender from the party finally called back. "Check your email now." My pulse quickened slightly, but I kept my face calm while opening the message beneath the tablecloth. Attached was a scanned copy of a written incident statement from the bartender working my graduation party. I recognized his name immediately. Noah Bennett. My eyes locked onto one sentence halfway down the page. "I observed Mrs. Sandra Carter replace Miss Evelyn Carter's champagne glass approximately 10 minutes before the medical emergency." My breathing slowed instead of speeding up. Strange. I expected panic. Rage. Something explosive. Instead I felt clarity. Cold and sharp. Across the table, my mother smiled faintly while lifting her wine glass. "I hope after tonight we can finally move forward as a family." I looked up slowly from my phone and met her eyes for the first time without fear. Then I smiled back. Not because I forgave her. Because at that exact moment, I finally understood something my parents never imagined possible. Their version of the story was beginning to fall apart. My mother kept smiling at me across the candlelit table, completely unaware that the story she had spent my entire life controlling was finally slipping out of her hands. I slipped my phone quietly back into my purse beside the recorder and lifted my water glass with steady fingers. "I would like that too," I said softly. "Moving forward sounds nice." My father relaxed almost immediately after hearing those words. I saw it in the way his shoulders loosened slightly, the way he reached for his wine again without studying me so carefully anymore. Relief. That was the first genuine emotion I had seen from him all evening. He believed the problem was contained. My mother even smiled warmly enough to look maternal for a moment. "Good," she said gently. "Families survive when people stop clinging to resentment." Clinging to resentment. I nearly laughed hearing that from the woman who had spent 22 years treating affection like something earned through obedience. Dinner ended shortly after that. My father walked me to the front door while my mother cleared plates in the kitchen with practiced elegance. Mason disappeared upstairs without saying goodbye. Typical. He had spent his entire life surviving our parents by becoming invisible whenever accountability entered the room. At the doorway, my father rested one hand against the frame while giving me the same polished smile he used in magazine interviews. "I think tonight was productive," he said calmly. I looked out toward the quiet suburban street glowing beneath warm porch lights. I think so too. He studied me for another second before lowering his voice slightly. Your mother worries about appearances more than most people understand. Sometimes she says things emotionally. Emotionally. Interesting choice of word considering my emotions had always been treated like character defects while hers became excuses. I understand, I replied quietly. My father nodded once, satisfied. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Dad. I walked down the stone pathway toward the street without looking back. Claire was waiting inside her car exactly where we planned. The second I slid into the passenger seat, she turned toward me anxiously. What happened? I closed the door gently before answering. Everything. We drove away from my parents' neighborhood slowly while I explained the conversation, the admissions, the way my father spoke about me like a difficult investment instead of a daughter. Claire listened in complete silence until I finally handed her the recording device. Please tell me it worked. She plugged headphones into the recorder immediately while parked at a red light downtown. A few seconds later, her eyes widened. My father's voice filled the car quietly through the speakers. Some children are easier to love than others. Then my mother. You were difficult to raise, Evelyn. Claire slowly removed the headphones while staring at me in disbelief. This is enough to destroy them publicly. I looked out the window at passing storefront lights reflecting against wet pavement. Publicly. The word lingered heavily in my chest because for most of my life, public image had been my parents' religion. They built their entire identities around admiration. Charity galas. Business awards. Perfect family portraits. Every cruel thing they ever did happened privately behind closed doors where nobody important could hear it. But now I had their voices. Their words. Their own calm admissions recorded clearly enough that no amount of polished smiling could explain them away. 3 weeks later, the investigation officially began after Noah Bennett submitted his statement directly to police along with security footage recovered from a backup server at the catering company. The footage showed my mother replacing my champagne glass moments before handing it to me. My father's law firm immediately released statements calling the situation a misunderstanding fueled by family tensions. But recordings do not care about reputation. Neither do insurance documents. Within days, local news outlets picked up the story. Then national blogs. Then business magazines that once praised Richard Carter began quietly removing his interviews from their websites. My mother stopped attending charity events entirely. Mason moved out of their house before the end of the month. As for me, I accepted a financial consulting position in Seattle 6 months later. Small apartment. Rainy mornings. Peaceful silence. Sometimes people still ask whether I miss my family. I usually smile politely before changing the subject because the truth is complicated. I do not miss the people who raised me. I miss the version of parents I spent my whole life hoping they would become. But hope can make people survive terrible things for far too long. And the girl they spent years calling difficult finally learned something that changed everything. Some families do not break your heart all at once. They do it quietly. One dinner. One insult. One smile at a time.